you already got the lowdown. I'm Evan Light. I call myself a freelance mentor and code janitor. I used to just say code janitor. That's to say I clean up a lot of other developer shit. A freelance mentor in the sense that I like to help other people write better software, usually through remote pairing, and or help them clean up their own software so that way I don't have to. And these are a couple things that I do. I run Ruby Decamp, which the shirt, it's an unconference, well, open space event / unconference in the DC area. It's about 75 people. It's going into its 6th year now. And in 2014, it's usually the end of September, early October. It's 3 evenings, it's 3 days and 3 evenings, really. First day is an all-day code retreat. If you don't know what that is, you can just do a quick Google. And the next 2 days are an open space event. You can Google open space technology if you're curious to learn more about it. But basically, Decamp just takes the whole conference model and, like this, except, well, I'm not going to talk about beer and Decamp. Talk to Aaron about that if you're curious. We kind of take the conference model and we turn it upside down. So our usual conference is really the hallway track. It's not to say it's completely unstructured. But anyway, it's a kind of unique thing. If you're interested, look around, talk to people. It's not exactly an invite-only thing, but you have to know someone who knows someone in order to get in. I invite a few people, but then the rest of it's up to everyone else. I'm also on the Ruby Freelancers podcast. That's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A bunch of us freelancers who do Ruby work tend to sit around and ruminate on how to get more work, how to manage your clients, et cetera, et cetera. What I don't have on here, because we don't have a logo yet, is I started doing a screencast with Z Spencer and a few other folks called Growing Software Developers, which is about starting off as a software developer and how you can become a better software developer when you're starting out. So having said all that, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this comic strip. If you're not, just take a quick look. And in a nutshell, this is why I do presentations. Because someone is wrong, it pisses me off, and I have to talk about it. So that's why I'm up here. Again, it's also why I write blog posts, usually. I don't write that often because I don't get that pissed off that often. But when I see someone who's very wrong, I have to write a blog post. And that's kind of also where this presentation came from. This blog post, let's see, was basically about loosely coupling all the things in Rails. That's kind of become de rigueur, the latest fashion. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it because while it's a Ruby conference, this is a Ruby conference, most of us work in Rails. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. It would be too obvious. And as I said, the latest fashion is, well, let's be extremely OO with Rails. Well, Rails isn't exactly all that OO. I mean, Rails is designed to make small app development fast, but emphasis on the small. It's good at small app development. And it does that, among other ways, with shortcuts that take advantage of selective type coupling. For example, the coupling we have between the views and the controllers in Rails, that we pass instance variables around between them. That is considered very nasty by some people, but it's a really handy shortcut for just look up the data, get into the template, and off you go. And then I'm sure, as most of you are aware, that Rails has a lot of constraints, and they're intentional. It's opinionated software. That helps us maybe the first 80% of our apps, but what do we do for, well, okay, those are the examples already. So what do we do for the remaining 20%? What techniques do you use? What gems do you use? Well, that's a kind of tricky topic. It really depends, because there are so many choices. There are so many patterns books out there, so many Rails recipes out there. So really, it's a heuristic, which is a fancy word for saying it's based on experience. So if you're a fairly new Rails developer, that's another way of saying you're screwed. Or you have to know someone who's more experienced. So moving right along, Sarah said earlier in her talk yesterday, essentially, that anecdotes suck as evidence. And I agree. So I did a lot of research. And then when I was done doing research, I started working on slides, and then I caught myself doing more research. It became kind of a compulsion. I read through a few different books, and I have lots of citations in here. I linked the citations. Bears mentioning these slides are done in something called Keydown. That is, that they're really just HTML and JavaScript. And I'm going to have them up on GitHub pages after the presentation, so you don't have to worry about taking any notes unless there's something interesting that I say, maybe. Otherwise, you'll just be able to get the slides, page through them, and click on all the links, and there are a lot of links. So all the source material is easy to get to. So first book that I'll talk about just a little bit, or in passing here, is The Paradox of Choice, because realizing there are so many options, how do people deal with those options? This is something I'd heard about, I think, from actually a talk at Google. There's a YouTube video of the author giving a talk there. So a couple of quotes here. One of them is, choosing well is especially difficult for those of us who are determined to make only the best choices. I've worked with a lot of clients as a consultant. I mean, I've been a freelancer for 3.5 years now, I guess, and I've worked with a lot of different shops. And usually they bring me in because they don't have any experienced Rails developers, or they don't have any veteran, really, Rails developers. They don't know what choices to make, so they ask me to help them make them on their behalf. But a lot of shops don't do that, so they just make choices. So if they make choices without the benefit of experience, what kind of choices does the average developer make? Let's talk about that some. So we would be better off if we embrace certain voluntary constraints on our freedom of choice instead of rebelling against them. Sound a little bit like Rails, maybe? So one interesting phenomena of choice mentioned in the book is that apparently we are not too rational about how we choose. We'd like to think we are, but we have a tendency to select, to go with information that's readily available as opposed to information that's reliable. The example the author gives in the book, I believe there was a study or two that he cited as well, but the example is a simple one. Shopping for a new car. You want to find a nice, safe new car. Well, so one of the best things you could probably do, and he talks about in the book also, is you could go to the Consumer Reports website. It's a nonprofit. They do tons of research. They collect a lot of data. So it's reliable information. It's just fairly objective. It's a bit dry, but it's a great way to shop for a car. But say you find that the most reliable car, or rather the safest car, is a Volvo. Now, we'll talk about that one in a minute later. But say you find that the safest car is a Volvo. But then a good friend of yours says, no, the Volvo is not that safe. You really want, say, a Cadillac, because it's a boat. And I have a Cadillac, and I got in an accident, and everything was great. That's an anecdote. But it's from someone we know, so we tend to favor that information. Maybe the people in this room wouldn't do that. I mean, I use Consumer Reports, for example, and I will listen to anecdotes that people give me, but usually I'm going to go with what I see in Consumer Reports. But most people are actually fairly vulnerable to effective advertising. And I know you're probably thinking, well, that's not me, but it probably is by degrees. I'm not going to go into graphic detail here, but the paradox of choice talks about several different very simple techniques that advertisers use that are highly reliable, and I was reading through them thinking, oh, yep, I've been fooled with that, I've been fooled with that, I've been fooled with that. There are some obvious ones that maybe we're good at avoiding, but there was mentioning of like anchoring, and I can't remember the descriptions all that well, so it's a worthwhile book to read. It's a fairly fast read, too. So let's get a little bit more into the software culture here. So Alan Kay, the guy who invented Smalltalk, once said, once you have something that grows faster than education grows, you're always going to get a pop culture. So I'll just take a moment to observe that, well, I don't know how many of you are fresh out of school, but most of us, if not all of us, we didn't learn to program in Ruby in school. We didn't learn to program Rails in school. We got it from blog posts and books and not any kind of formal education or really structured education. I think that kind of qualifies us for a pop culture. So let me introduce this word. I actually cobbled it together in my brain, Googled it, and lo and behold, someone had already come up with it. Neophilia, new and love, basically loving new things, kind of an obsession with new things. That's us. I mean, you probably came to Ruby because you were dissatisfied. You came to Rails because you were dissatisfied with whatever you're using before. For me, it was J2EE made me want to cry and quit being a software engineer and become a manager and be miserable. And that would have been better than working in J2EE. I'm sure you guys probably had some kind of similar experience. But once you got to the Rails community, you know how it is that there's always a new gem coming out, maybe every few months or every year, to replace the functionality of some other gem you were using before. The new hotness is not what you were using a few months ago that you have running in your production application. So do you upgrade to the new hotness or not? Well, a lot of developers who are less experienced might do that. So what I like to say, to borrow from journalists, and you've probably seen this image if you were here last year, is if it bleeds, it leads. Except not in the sense of if it's bloody and there's murder, then it's going to be on the front page of the paper. But if it's bleeding edge, it's what we're talking about all the time. Because all our blog posts, all of our conferences, we're usually talking about, if we're not talking about meta stuff like this, we're talking about new tools and new techniques. And that is our pop culture, new tools and techniques. So this is a maybe somewhat obscure reference that I suspect maybe 1% of this audience will actually get. Aaron, did you get it? Yeah? Oh, cool. Corey did too. So this is from Star Trek: The Motion Picture. This is probably dating me as getting a little bit old now finally, because this is from the late 70s. And this is just a line Dr. McCoy is saying to Captain Kirk when he's bitching about the medical bay or sick bay in the upgraded Enterprise. He says, "I know engineers, they love to change things." He expects the sick bay to be all rearranged. Well, that's what we're always doing in the Rails community, or the Ruby community at large. We're always coming up with new tools, new techniques. And we don't necessarily have the new tools and techniques. It's evolutionary. We don't necessarily have the best ideas. Ideally, we're weeding out the bad ones through experience, but experimentation is necessary. So let's talk about patterns a little bit. We'll get to tools in a little bit later. I'm sure you're all familiar with the basic idea of what a pattern is. It's basically just an example, something to emulate. There's a precondition, and then apply this technique. So we identify the practice, how we get our patterns, then you propose it as a pattern. It ends up in one or many books or on blog posts or what have you. But then if it can be imitated, then maybe it can be automated. So some wise guy comes along and says, "Hey, I don't want to go bang out all this code every time. I see myself using this. I've used this a bunch of times. It's repetitive, or I see myself potentially using this a lot. So I'm going to just try to implement a generic case." So we create a tool from the pattern. Then we use a tool, and then we identify its best practice patterns, because the tools themselves have patterns that they are better suited to, like, say, Rails. There's the Rails way. And then we tend to identify the failings in the tools. So familiarity breeds contempt, because for whatever reason, I guess in this particular year, it seems like it's kind of cool to hate on Rails a bit and pick on it and say it needs to be more object-oriented. So step 6 is go to 1 and look for the next new shiny pattern. So, that's supposed to say Rails pattern, not Raise pattern, so looks like I'm trying to speak in bad Spanish or French. These are some patterns out of a book I'm going to mention in just a minute. Don't concern yourself too much with them. You'll be able to look them all up later if you want, but some of those should look kind of familiar to you. And they're from this book by Martin Fowler, The Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, if I put you to sleep, I'm sorry, but read this book, please. It's not an easy read, I'll grant you that, but it's pretty mind-opening and eye-opening, at least it very much was for me. It was actually, so let me go back just a second. It was written in 2003, so it's kind of a bit dated, predated Rails, and it came just a little bit after the J2EE revolution, if you will. So it's kind of a step up from the initial J2EE web frameworks that we had. And I'm talking about Java because that was my perspective, but I think that's where Fowler came from too. But so I mentioned these patterns here. They came from that book. These kind of forecast a lot of what is in Rails. So it's a little bit eye-opening in terms of seeing how the patterns work, how they could work better as well. So let's talk about, just briefly, I'm just going to cite a list of some patterns that we've come up with lately. I call them post-Rails Rails patterns, because if we're in a post-Rails age, these are the tools we've come up with because we think Rails sucks in particular ways. I'm going to spare you the details on most of these. So the question again is, why? What's wrong with Rails? So let's go into a little bit of detail. So the popular wisdom says persistence and domain logic should not coexist in a model class. Lately, it's become very popular to hate on active record. I think Brian mentioned it in his presentation at one point. I sympathize. Yay callbacks, yay filters, yay this, yay that. Well, then after your app grows a little bit, your models get a little complex. Ugh, callbacks you had in there. So active record, as defined by Martin Fowler, which I recall hearing, anecdote though, bear with me, that the active record gem is actually the most accurate implementation of the active record pattern that he has defined in the book. Defines an object that wraps a row in a database or table or view, encapsulates a database access, and adds domain logic on that data. So this, though, is some UML for what the prevailing wisdom says to do. Because you guys know what active record is already. I mean, most of you guys do Rails all the time. I know there are a few who don't. But this has a domain model object on the left side. Then we have some finder that goes out to and gets a gateway object, which is a fancy way of saying an object that knows how to persist itself and contains the data, but it doesn't do any operations on it. And that's what the prevailing wisdom says to do. But there's a pattern for that, and it's called the row data gateway. This is actually in the Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. It exactly describes how we're trying to use Rails active record now. So I want to kind of reiterate here that active record is a pattern. It says data plus logic. Row data gateway says separate them. And the way we're trying to use active record a lot these days, the contemporary wisdom says separate them. But that's not active record anymore. So seeing as how the prevailing wisdom says that, this quote kind of early in the book jumped out at me. It's been bugging me. That's where this presentation came from. It's been bugging me. So what I propose is really kind of simple. Instead of fighting Rails, why don't we just try to be more Rails than Rails? Why don't we just try to evolve along the same idioms that we already have instead of trying to go off obliquely and fight and work against the grain? So also, to borrow from Fowler here, I'm sure you can read the quote for yourself, but in a nutshell, he says active record is for simple models. Data mapper, a pattern, another pattern, is good for more complex mappings between the database and your data models. So again, if the mapping is simple, active record. If it's complex, data mapper. So simple, complex, which one do you want? Well, guess what? That's another heuristic. But let's go on and talk some about data mapper. This is some UML for the data mapper pattern. Just to explain very simply, the thing on the left is your domain model object. The mapper does most of the work. The mapper goes out to the database, gets the data, creates a domain model object, and returns it to the caller. Similarly, you pass a domain model object as input to the mapper, and then the mapper deconstructs it, puts the data into the database. The persistence is completely separate from the domain model. This is what we're trying to accomplish right now with active record. This is a completely different pattern than active record. Anyone notice a problem here? So we get a clear separation between the data source, the mapping of the source to the model, and the model itself. This is pretty much what people have been clamoring for lately. So one particularly odd idea I had heard was people were trying to essentially use active record as a data mapper. And this was kind of my reaction to that. But let's talk about this a little bit, because there's this other pattern in the book called the repository pattern. And really what the repository pattern does is it hides the mapping from the database to the domain model object. It also provides a gateway for performing a query. So it's just really a wrapper layer around some hypothetical mapper, so that the details of the mapper are hidden from you. So so actually let me go through these particular citations here, then we're going to get onto a gem that kind of tries to do this. So I've long held to the belief that layering and abstraction has a cost. It's not something that's discussed popularly. We love to abstract things. We love to break things apart into little pieces and make them simple and write lots of nice unit tests around them, but you have to put them together eventually. You have to use them in a context, and that means you have to think about them at a higher level. You have more moving parts to deal with. There's more burden on your brain managing all those parts. So again, Martin Fowler, you should be used to seeing the name by now. Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture, read the damn book. I'm not going to read the quote to you again, but in a nutshell, layering is a good thing, but it can also hurt you. Indirection, you sometimes get cascading changes, right? That's the problem with layering, is that I'm sure you're familiar, where when you tease something apart into multiple pieces, sometimes if you're, say, dependency injecting a value, you might have to pass that to another object that you wrapped that might have to pass it to another object that you wrapped. And then so the dependency cascades, and so one change in one place might actually end up cascading in several places. So you might believe that you don't have too much, you might believe that you have low coupling, and actually you have somewhat high coupling. Indirection is a lot like layering, also cuts both ways. So every time you break one thing into two pieces, you have more than one thing to manage, what I was saying earlier. That's also Martin Fowler. I'd like to think if you're not going to listen to me, at least listen to him. So managing software complexity is hard. Take a break, have another beer? No? Okay, fine. I'll keep going. So EDR is a gem that I came upon lately that implements this repository pattern that I mentioned earlier. Really tiny text here, but that's a link to a blog post that talks quite a bit about it. But I have some code samples from the blog post in here. So this is an example, EDR is an example of using active record as a data mapper, a very simple data mapper, but using active record as a very simple data mapper in a repository. So active record, as you know, does a one-to-one mapping between a table and a domain model object. Data mapper doesn't require that. So you could say that active record can be used as a really dumb data mapper, where it's a highly constrained one that only does a one-to-one mapping. So this is your active record object. In this case, all it does is define the relationships and, well, validations. Then you have a domain model object that has an extra E on line 3. So just pretend that's not there. And but you look at this and note that this doesn't look like a plain old Ruby object. There's some EDR-specific stuff going on in here. And if that doesn't make you happy, then, well, welcome to the club. I didn't really like that so much when I saw it earlier. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then there's where you declare the mapping between the domain model object and the active record object. Does anyone notice a little bit of repetition there? Maybe something that could be cleaned up. And then you define the repository itself, which just mediates the queries and the creating of the domain model. So it's really pretty simple. It's just you define classical methods in your repository, performs the query, gets you back your domain model object, and vice versa, the other way around. So I think what could be done with EDR to make it potentially useful in the short term is that we could, say, do this via standards, because you see order data looks like a convention waiting to happen, right? So if you say that your active record object will always end in data, so you just look for the domain model object and use that, or actually probably better, look for the active record object, shave off data, look for the domain model object. And then this guy, declaring fields, why do we need to declare fields? Active record already does that, so couldn't we just have the framework reflect on the attributes, say, for example? And wrapping associations, why do we have to declare the associations on the model? Can't we also get that off active record? So what I'm left with is, can't we just have a plain old domain model entirely by convention, maybe mix in any specific behavior we need for the framework at runtime, and then your domain model class is just a plain old Ruby object, and you could just test it ordinarily just without a database. So I saw that, and I thought, gee, that would be really nice, and I'd do it right now, except I'm working on these damn slides. So, PDI, please do investigate. I might actually also after this talk, but as I said, I was kind of busy. I think this might be a good stopgap, but really, I think we should consider using the data mapper pattern. I don't mean the data mapper gem. The data mapper gem, there's, I guess, 1.5 incarnations right now. The current data mapper is actually an active record object, but let me get there. The reason we don't want to use data mapper is because it's all Jessica's fault. But I'm going to keep moving right along here. The real reason we don't want to use data mapper is because it's not a true data mapper, as I said. It's actually an active record. I hope that's not confusing. Note the white space between data and mapper, and white space between active and record. Talking about patterns on the right, gems on the left. Data mapper 2, however, is still very much a work in progress. You don't want to try using it in production yet. It's not ready. It's still missing any kind of session management, so application-specific transactions. The pattern that Martin Fowler uses is, he calls it a unit of work, something that tracks all the different changes that have been made to the domain model, so that way when you say go persist it, that it knows which things to persist. It doesn't have that. It's missing a few other capabilities, but it's been coming along, and quite frankly, after this talk, I want to go work on it. I've been talking to, before this talk, I was talking to Dan Cubb, the guy who's the lead developer on it, and they're Peter Solnica, actually, 2 people who work with Matt. Is there a smile over there? Yes, good. 2 people that work with Matt, and Dan's a great guy. I'm hoping to work with him a little bit on it because I think this is the future. I'll talk about that a little more later. But as I already said, it's still work in progress, always looking for help. Dan is a great guy if you're looking for an open source project, maybe to get your feet wet on. Really, he's a super nice guy, very bright, great to work with. Couldn't recommend more highly. So it'd be a great project to work on if you want to try to get into open source. So his contact information on Twitter, again, you don't have to write all this down. And the data mapper channel on IRC. So let's give another example. As we all know, Rails templating sucks. But you can more easily say, really, templating just sucks. It sucked for the past, 15 15 years, 20 years almost now, hard to believe. So, because we had JSPs, ASPs, all that business, and then we had ERB, which is really not all that terribly different when applied to web pages, and Haml makes it a little bit better, and there are all kinds of other templating approaches, and yes, you could say things like Mustache make it maybe a little better, getting more logic out of the templates, but templating sucks, which is basically what Fowler is saying here, that templating is hard to maintain and hard to change, and hard to test, rather. One of the modern, or a few of the modern techniques that are often applied are presenters, decorators, and view models. I'm not going to go into that right now because I don't know where Mike Moore is if he's in this room right now. But in any event, he did a presentation. I guess he's not going to see that I mentioned him. He did a presentation on all about all the differences between these. Good presentation, watch that. Jeff Casimir did a presentation on how we need to try to get away from fat models, where he introduces Draper, which is a presenter gem. Go watch that. I'm not going to talk about those. This has been very well covered. But I'm going to introduce another alternative. Really, one of the things that helped inspire this talk was I was introduced to the cells gem by Nick Sutterer about a year ago. And cells proposes that we just don't use partials anymore, that instead we try a more model view controller approach to our views. And what an example of cells look like, here's a template. Instead of render, partial, we're rendering a cell, so we have a different method called. And a cell should look kind of familiar because in a lot of ways it's like a controller. Although I think it requires that we explicitly call render at the end of the action. I don't know if Nick's going to change that at some point in the future. But hey, you could always contribute to it. It's open source as well. But the idea behind cells is that instead of these partials, we just have layers of nested components inside of our view. So instead of having one controller that has all these different instance variables, you have a controller that refers to a view, that refers to a nested controller or nested controllers for different components that have their own views, and so on and so on. So if you want to make your views and your controllers more testable, you could break them into more pieces. I already mentioned MVC. And we end up with the layering problem I mentioned earlier. The indirection can cost you because then you might have a cascading changes problem where something that you passed, and this is not entirely unique to cells, though. You probably have this with your partials. You have an instance variable you set in the controller. You pass it to a partial, which has to get passed to a partial, which has to get passed to a partial, and maintaining that can be a pain. So can we be more Rails than Rails? Cells, maybe. I think it could possibly use a little bit of help. Data Mapper 2, definitely, but it's not there yet. It needs a lot of help. But also, I'm also going to recommend that you guys be careful about which ideas you promote, especially if you're a quote-unquote pundit or domain expert. Because when a less experienced person is looking for information, if they don't have someone readily available, they're going to turn to Google, right? And Google's probably going to come up with blog posts and presentations. And blog posts and presentations are usually full of everyone's latest favorite pet projects and pet patterns. A lot of people are putting patterns and tools out there that haven't been particularly well tested, like this red tape gem that some jerk wrote a few months ago, and then promoting them publicly. So these new tools have the potential to be very useful, but if they haven't been well tried, then we could just be setting up less experienced people for a lot of pain. So what I recommend instead is that we try to agree on an augmentative stack on top of Rails, because there's that extra 20%. We know it's there. We know what some of the problems are these days. Why don't we try to agree on how we can go a little bit further than Rails, maybe go another 5 or 10%? Because that's going to make it easier not just for the experts, but especially for the new people. So that's what I mean when I say here, consider your audience. Frankly, the average developer is not as talented as most of the people in this room. And I'm not just pandering when I say that. You're going to a conference because you're interested in growing as a developer. Average developers are not really interested in growing. I know I've worked with a lot as a consultant. So if we can give them more low-hanging fruit to work with, then they're going to come up with better work, which will make our jobs easier too. It means we can focus on the hard problems. So I already mentioned Data Mapper 2 and cells. Cells can help you now, although I think it could probably be a little bit better. The Draper gem is a very nice interface. Actually, the maintainer's right over there, so blame him, Steve Klabnik. Hi, Steve. Has a very nice interface, a nice way to help you get some of your logic out of your templates. Again, that downside in terms of object orientation is we're introducing a whole other different kind of object, so it's a little more complexity, so maybe it's not so friendly to the average developer, but it might be good for you guys. I already mentioned for the future, Data Mapper 2 and EDR. Both of these could use your love, and that's all I've got.